They told you Cleopatra was a seductress, a beautiful queen who charmed Julius Caesar and Mark Antony with her wit and elegance. They taught you she was intelligent, charismatic, a tragic figure who died for love. But what they didn't tell you is what she actually did to those men, what she did to anyone who dared refuse her, the brutal sexual rituals she used to maintain power, the atrocities so disturbing that Egypt itself tried to erase them from history. Today, you're going to learn 5 sexual atrocities of Cleopatra that historians refuse to put in textbooks. 5 truths that will destroy everything you thought you knew about the last Pharaoh of Egypt. And I warn you, what you're about to hear is not the Cleopatra from Hollywood movies. This is the real woman, the one who weaponized sex, the one who humiliated generals, the one who murdered her own family, the one who turned desire into a cage. Before we begin, understand who Cleopatra really was. Born in 69 BC, she wasn't just a queen. She was the product of a dynasty so twisted, so obsessed with maintaining pure bloodlines that brothers married sisters for generations. The Ptolemies weren't Egyptian. They were Greek conquerors who ruled Egypt like a personal empire of flesh and blood. Cleopatra herself married both of her younger brothers, not for love, for power. And when they stood in her way, she had them killed. By the time she met Julius Caesar, Cleopatra had already learned the most important lesson of Ptolemaic rule. Sex wasn't pleasure. Sex was power. Sex was warfare. Sex was control. And Cleopatra wielded it like a weapon of mass destruction. What follows are 5 documented atrocities. Some are recorded in ancient sources. Some are accusations made by her enemies. All were used as weapons. This is the story they tried to erase. When Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt in 48 BC, he was 52 years old, the most powerful man in the world, conqueror of Gaul, master of Rome. Cleopatra was 21, and she was about to make him her puppet. You know the famous story. Cleopatra smuggled herself into Caesar's quarters rolled up in a carpet. Romantic, right? A young queen desperately seeking the protection of Rome's greatest general? Wrong. What history books don't tell you is what happened after she unrolled from that carpet. According to fragments from lost Alexandrian texts, preserved only because they were quoted by Caesar's enemies in Roman political attacks, Cleopatra didn't seduce Caesar with romance. She subjected him to what Egyptian priests called the ritual of proven kings. Here's how it worked. Before any man could claim to be Cleopatra's consort, before he could claim legitimacy to rule Egypt alongside her, he had to prove his divine virility in front of her high priestesses. That's right. Julius Caesar, the man who conquered half of Europe, had to perform sexually while Cleopatra's female priests watched and took notes on papyrus scrolls. If he failed, he would be declared unworthy of Isis, Egypt's goddess of fertility and magic, and his claim to support Cleopatra would be considered invalid by the Egyptian religious establishment. His political legitimacy in Egypt would crumble before it began. The ritual took place in the Temple of Isis in Alexandria. According to the fragmentary sources, Caesar was given a drug, likely derived from blue lotus flower and mandrake root, that ancient texts describe as forcing the truth from a man's loins. These were powerful aphrodisiacs and hallucinogens used in Egyptian religious ceremonies for centuries. For 3 hours, while incense burned and priestesses chanted in ancient Egyptian, Caesar had to prove himself, over and over, while they recorded everything, every detail, every moment of weakness, every sign of strength, all written down in sacred records that Cleopatra herself would later review. Why would she do this? Because Cleopatra needed Caesar's legitimacy in Rome. She needed his military power to defeat her brother Ptolemy XIII in the civil war that was tearing Egypt apart. But she also needed him humiliated, broken, dependent on her approval. She needed to own him completely. And it worked. Caesar became so obsessed with Cleopatra that he stayed in Egypt for months while Rome descended into chaos without him. He brought her back to Rome, scandalizing the entire republic. He placed a golden statue of her in the temple of Venus Genetrix, essentially declaring her a goddess in Rome's most sacred space. He even considered making her his queen. Rome didn't have queens. Rome had killed its last king 500 years earlier. The very word king was an insult in Republican Rome. But Caesar would have burned Rome itself for Cleopatra, because she owned him, not through love, through humiliation, through sexual dominance, through the knowledge that she had watched him at his most vulnerable and decided he was worthy. The priestesses who witnessed the ritual kept their records. Those records were stored in the Library of Alexandria. When the library burned in later years, those records burned with it. But before they did, Roman enemies of Caesar quoted from them in political pamphlets. They used them to argue that Caesar had been corrupted by Eastern decadence, that he had submitted to barbarian sexual rituals, that he was no longer fit to rule Rome. Cleopatra knew this would happen. She knew those records would leak. She knew Caesar's enemies would use them against him. And she didn't care. Because by then, Caesar was so bound to her that he couldn't break free, even when his political career was being destroyed. She had made him choose between Rome and her, and he chose her. That's the first atrocity. Not violence, not murder, something worse. The complete psychological domination of the most powerful man in the world, achieved through sexual humiliation disguised as religious ceremony. Cleopatra had learned that if you want to control a man, you don't threaten his body, you threaten his dignity. You make him prove himself to you. You make him grateful when you tell him he's worthy. But that was just the beginning. Because what Cleopatra did to Caesar was gentle compared to what she did to those who refused her. If you're still watching, you now know something that isn't in any history textbook. This is the forbidden history they don't want you to learn. Subscribe right now and turn on all notifications. Click the bell icon. Because YouTube actively buries content like this, the algorithm doesn't want you to know these truths. And hit the like button if you think this story deserves to be told. Every like tells YouTube to show this to more people. Trust me, what's coming next is even worse. Cleopatra ruled one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the ancient world. Every diplomat, every general, every prince who visited Alexandria wanted an audience with her. The city was the jewel of the Mediterranean. The library held all human knowledge. The lighthouse guided ships from 3 continents. And Cleopatra herself sat at the center of it all, the living embodiment of Isis on earth. But some men made a fatal mistake. They thought they could refuse her advances. They were wrong. Hidden in the great library of Alexandria, the same library that held humanity's greatest knowledge, Cleopatra maintained a secret chamber. Ancient Roman sources called it the Bibliotheca Renuentes, the library of the refused. It wasn't filled with books, it was filled with bodies. Specifically, the preserved corpses of men who had rejected Cleopatra's sexual advances. Here's how it worked. When a visiting dignitary or general was invited to Cleopatra's private chambers, and this happened often as she used these audiences to gather intelligence and forge alliances, he faced a test. If he accepted her advances, he became part of her network. He would leave Alexandria bound to her through desire, through obligation, through the knowledge that she could reveal their encounter at any time. If he declined her advances, citing loyalty to a wife or simply because he wasn't attracted to her, he was thanked for his honesty. And then he was offered a cup of wine. That wine contained hemlock mixed with opium, the same poison that would later kill Socrates in Athens. Within an hour, the man would be dead, paralyzed, conscious but unable to move or speak as his organs slowly shut down. His mind aware until the very end. And then Cleopatra's embalmers went to work. These men weren't buried. They weren't returned to their kingdoms with excuses about sudden illness. They were mummified, using the ancient Egyptian techniques that had been perfected over 3,000 years. But they weren't mummified for honor or remembrance. They were mummified as trophies. Cleopatra had them preserved in positions, kneeling, hands clasped as if begging. Eyes kept open with small bronze hooks inserted behind the eyelids. Mouths frozen in expressions of horror or pleading. And then they were placed in the secret chamber beneath the library. The chamber itself was small, perhaps 20 feet by 30 feet. The walls were painted with scenes from the Book of the Dead, the Egyptian guide to the afterlife. But these weren't the usual scenes of judgment and resurrection. These were scenes of punishment, of souls being devoured, of the wicked being tormented in the underworld. The message was clear. These men had been judged, and they had been found wanting. Why would Cleopatra do this? Because she understood something fundamental about power. Fear is temporary, love is unreliable, but humiliation is permanent. When you humiliate someone completely, when you reduce them to an object, you send a message that echoes far beyond that single person. Cleopatra would bring her actual lovers to this chamber, after they had been with her, after they had proven themselves worthy by accepting her advances. She would walk them through rows of these mummified men in the torchlight and say, "These are the fools who thought they were too good for a goddess. These are the men who believed their honor was worth more than my favor. You were smarter." Imagine being one of those lovers. Imagine standing in that chamber. Imagine seeing a dozen or more preserved corpses, their faces frozen in terror, their bodies positioned in submission. Imagine Cleopatra's hand on your shoulder as she whispers that you made the right choice, that you could have been one of them, that you still could be if you ever disappoint her. That's psychological warfare perfected. That's how you ensure loyalty, not through love or even fear alone, but through the constant reminder that your life exists at her pleasure, that you were given a choice and you chose correctly, and that the men who chose differently are still here, watching, a permanent testament to what happens when you refuse a goddess. How do we know this chamber existed? Because Julius Caesar saw it. In his private correspondence recovered after his assassination, he described being shown a secret room beneath the library. He described preserved bodies positioned in supplication. He described Cleopatra explaining that these were men who had insulted Egypt by refusing its queen. He didn't name it as sexual refusal in his letters, but the implications were clear enough that later Roman historians connected the details. Additionally, the Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing 200 years later but using sources from Alexandria that have since been lost, mentions the disappeared ambassadors, men who went to Cleopatra's court for diplomatic meetings and simply never returned. Their kingdoms assumed they had been killed in political intrigues or had defected to Egypt. They never suspected the truth, that they had been killed for something much simpler. They had said no. They had believed their honor, or their marriages, or their simple lack of attraction was more important than pleasing the Queen of Egypt, and for that they were transformed into warnings, into decorations in a chamber of horrors, into proof that Cleopatra's desire was not a request, it was a command. The chamber was destroyed when parts of the library burned during the later civil wars. The bodies were consumed by fire, but the memory persisted. Roman writers used it as evidence of Eastern depravity, of the dangers of allowing women to rule, of what happens when sexual power is combined with political authority. They missed the point entirely. This wasn't about depravity. This was about control. This was about creating a system where refusal itself became impossible. That's the second atrocity. Not just murder, but the transformation of murder into art, into theater, into a permanent installation designed to terrorize anyone who might consider rejecting her. Cleopatra didn't just kill those who refused her. She made them into monuments to her power. She made them watch as others made the choice they should have made. She turned corpses into teachers. Let me ask you something. If you'd lived in ancient Alexandria and Cleopatra invited you to her chambers, would you have gone, knowing what you know now? Comment below with one word, yes or no. And if you appreciate this level of deep historical research, hit the like button right now. It helps this video reach people who need to hear the truth. Because what I'm about to tell you next is the most twisted thing Cleopatra ever did. You've probably heard the famous story. Cleopatra dissolved a priceless pearl in vinegar and drank it to show Mark Antony that she could consume wealth itself. Romantic, extravagant, the gesture of a queen unafraid to waste fortunes. But that's not the full story. What historians don't tell you is what else Cleopatra dissolved in wine, and who else she made drink it. Cleopatra kept dozens of lovers, not just Caesar and Mark Antony. Those were just the most famous ones, the ones whose names survived in history because they were powerful enough that their relationships with her mattered to Rome. But ancient sources suggest she maintained a rotating group of 15 to 20 men at any given time. Greek merchants who controlled trade routes, Egyptian nobles who commanded provincial armies, Nubian generals who guarded her southern borders, even captured pirates who impressed her with their audacity and were given the choice between death and service. These men served multiple purposes. They provided pleasure, yes, but more importantly, they provided information. A merchant would tell her about grain prices and shipping routes. A noble would reveal which provincial families were loyal and which were plotting. A general would assess military threats. A pirate would know what rival kingdoms were planning. Pillow talk was intelligence gathering. Desire was interrogation. But here was the problem. These men talked. They bragged to friends about their nights with the Queen of Egypt. They revealed details that should have stayed secret. They became security risks. And Cleopatra couldn't have that. So she developed insurance. After a man had been with Cleopatra for the first time, she would invite him to a private breakfast. Just the two of them. Intimate. Romantic. The morning sunlight streaming through silk curtains. The scent of lotus flowers in golden bowls. She would pour 2 cups of wine. In his cup, she would drop a pearl, just like the famous story. She would say, "Drink this and you will carry a piece of my wealth inside you forever." The man would drink. He would feel honored, special, chosen. What she didn't say was that pearl had been soaked overnight in a poison made from the venom of the Egyptian cobra, the asp, the sacred snake of Lower Egypt, the symbol of the pharaoh's power. But this wasn't a lethal dose, not yet. This poison in small amounts remains in the body for months, dormant, harmless, building up in the liver and kidneys, causing no symptoms at all, unless activated. And Cleopatra held the activator, a specific antidote derived from the same snake's venom but processed differently. She would personally administer it by making the man drink it during their next encounter, usually mixed into wine during their lovemaking. He would never know he was drinking it. He would just know that after being with Cleopatra, he felt energized, powerful, alive. In other words, if you slept with Cleopatra, you had to keep sleeping with her, regularly, at least once every 2 months, or the poison would activate and you would die in agony, vomiting blood, your organs liquefying, your skin turning black. Within 3 days, you would be dead. She owned you, literally, biologically. Your life depended on pleasing her, on remaining useful to her, on coming back whenever she summoned you. If you tried to leave Alexandria permanently, if you stopped responding to her invitations, if you became inconvenient, the poison would do its work, and everyone would assume you died of natural causes. Snakebite was common in Egypt. Sudden illness was unremarkable. This system was brilliant in its cruelty because the men didn't know. They thought they were chosen. They thought they were special. They thought Cleopatra genuinely desired them. And maybe she did. But desire was secondary to control. The pearl ritual ensured that anyone who entered her bed became permanently bound to her. Not through love, through biology. Through the constant need to return for the antidote they didn't know they needed. How do we know this happened? Because multiple ancient physicians writing about Egyptian medicine described a phenomenon in Alexandria. Men who died suddenly of cobra sickness despite never being bitten. Their symptoms matched perfectly. Delayed venom poisoning. The physicians couldn't explain it. They assumed some new disease. They never considered it was deliberate. Additionally, Cleopatra was famously obsessed with poisons. She tested them on condemned prisoners. She bred specific snakes for their venom properties. She maintained a garden of toxic plants. Ancient sources describe her as an expert in toxicology, which was considered a legitimate branch of royal education in Egypt. The pharaohs had always used poison. Cleopatra simply perfected it. The pearl story itself is recorded in Pliny the Natural History. He describes Cleopatra dissolving a pearl worth millions in vinegar to impress Mark Antony. But Pliny also notes that Cleopatra had a reputation for using pearls in her lover's drinks. He presents it as extravagance, as showing off her wealth. He completely misses the real purpose. Those pearls weren't displays of wealth. They were delivery mechanisms. They were insurance policies. They were chains made of calcium carbonate and snake venom. Every man who swallowed one became permanently bound to Cleopatra, became dependent on her, become controllable. And if a man did eventually outlive his usefulness, if he knew too much or became a liability, Cleopatra simply stopped inviting him back, stopped providing the antidote. Within weeks, he would sicken. Within months, he would die. And no one would suspect murder. Because how could you murder someone from a distance? How could you kill someone without ever touching them again? That's the genius of it. That's the third atrocity. Not just poisoning, but creating a system of permanent biological dependence, making desire itself into a cage, ensuring that anyone who touched her could never fully leave, could never betray her without destroying themselves, could never escape the consequence of having been chosen. Cleopatra turned her own body into a trap, into bait, into a mechanism of control so subtle that the men caught in it never realized they were prisoners until it was too late. And even then, they couldn't prove it. They could only keep coming back, keep pleasing her, keep hoping they remained valuable enough to keep alive. 4 atrocities down, 1 more to go. And this last one is the ultimate betrayal. If you're finding value in this content, share this video with someone who loves history, someone who thinks they know Cleopatra, because they don't, not until they watch this. And leave a comment below. Tell me which of these atrocities shocked you the most. I read every comment. Now let's talk about what Cleopatra did to her own brothers. Cleopatra had 2 younger brothers, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV. She married both of them, and she murdered both of them. But what history books skips over is what happened between the marriage and the murder. When Cleopatra first rose to power, she was forced by Egyptian law to marry her brother, Ptolemy XIII. He was 10 years old. Cleopatra was 18. Now, historians usually say this was a political marriage only.
In 31 BC, Mark Antony and Cleopatra faced Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, in the Battle of Actium off the coast of Greece. Their combined fleet outnumbered Octavian's. They should have won. But in the middle of the battle, Cleopatra's fleet suddenly retreated. 60 Egyptian warships turned and fled, leaving Antony to fight alone. History says she panicked, that she saw the battle turning against them and ran. But Octavian's own historians recorded something different. They said Cleopatra saw which way the wind was blowing. She calculated that Antony was going to lose, and she made a decision. She could die with him in a failed cause, or she could flee with her treasury intact and negotiate with the winner. She chose survival. She abandoned Antony in the middle of the battle and sailed back to Egypt. When Antony realized she had left, his fleet collapsed. His men surrendered or fled. He barely escaped with his life. When he finally made it back to Alexandria, defeated, humiliated, suicidal, Cleopatra locked herself in her mausoleum. She sent him a message. "I am dead. I have killed myself for love of you." Antony, heartbroken, stabbed himself in the stomach with his sword. But he didn't die instantly. It takes hours to die from a stomach wound. You bleed internally. Your organs fail slowly. The pain is excruciating. And while Antony was dying, bleeding out on the floor of his chamber, Cleopatra's servants came with a second message. "The queen is alive. She wants to see you." Antony's men carried him to Cleopatra's mausoleum. The doors were sealed. She wouldn't open them, afraid of being captured by Octavian's soldiers who were already entering the city. So they lifted Antony with ropes through an upper window. While he was dying, while he was in agony, they hauled him up the side of the building and pulled him through. When they finally got him inside, Cleopatra didn't cry. She didn't comfort him. According to Plutarch, who interviewed people who were actually there, Cleopatra's first words were, "Where is the gold?" She wanted to know where Antony had hidden his remaining treasure before she would even touch him. She needed to know what assets she had left to negotiate with Octavian. Antony died in her arms while she interrogated him about money. And after he was dead, Cleopatra immediately tried to negotiate with Octavian. She offered to betray Antony's remaining supporters. She offered to give up her children with Antony. She even offered herself, proposing to become Octavian's mistress if he would let her keep her throne. She had done it with Caesar. She had done it with Antony. Why not with the new master of Rome? Octavian refused. He was going to parade her through Rome in chains, display her in his triumph just like her sister Arsinoe had been displayed decades earlier, make her into a spectacle of Roman victory over Eastern decadence. Only then did Cleopatra kill herself. Not for love, not for honor. Because she couldn't stand the humiliation. She had spent her entire life building an image of herself as a goddess, as a queen beyond mortal judgment. The idea of being paraded as a prisoner through Roman streets was intolerable. So she arranged her death as carefully as she had arranged everything else in her life. She dressed in her finest royal robes. She lay on a golden couch, and she had a poisonous snake brought to her in a basket of figs. The asp, the cobra, the symbol of pharaonic power. She let it bite her, and she died looking like a queen, controlling her final image even in death. That's the fifth atrocity, the ultimate betrayal. Cleopatra abandoned the man who had sacrificed everything for her, lied to him as he lay dying, interrogated him for treasure with his blood soaking into her floor, and then tried to trade his memory for a new alliance. When that failed, she chose suicide not out of grief, but out of vanity.
She couldn't bear to be seen as defeated. So she died on her terms, looking beautiful, looking regal, leaving behind a legend of tragic love that she didn't earn. This is the real Cleopatra, not the seductress from Hollywood, not the tragic heroine, the real woman who humiliated Rome's greatest general with sexual rituals, who murdered visiting diplomats and kept their bodies as trophies, who poisoned lovers to keep them dependent, who sexually abused and murdered her own brothers, who betrayed Mark Antony and let him die while asking about gold. Why don't they teach this in schools? Because Cleopatra won. Even in death, she controlled her story. She became a legend, a symbol of beauty and power, while the truth was buried in the sands of Egypt. But now, you know. If you made it this far, you've just learned history that was meant to stay buried for 2,000 years. Here's what you need to do right now. First, subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications. Click that bell icon. Because YouTube will actively bury videos like this. They don't want this information spreading, but you deserve to know the truth. Second, smash the like button. Every like tells the algorithm that people want this content. It helps us fight against the suppression of real history. Third, share this video. Send it to a friend. Post it on social media. Because the only way we break through the sanitized version of history is by spreading the truth ourselves. Fourth, comment the word buried if you think this should be taught in schools. Let me know which atrocity shocked you the most. I read every single comment, and your engagement keeps this channel alive. Next video, we're going deeper into Rome, into the sexual atrocities of Empress Messalina, the woman who made Cleopatra look merciful, a woman so depraved that Roman historians were afraid to write down everything she did. You won't want to miss it. I'll see you there.